All right. We are recording. Thank you all who are able to join us today in person. We are welcoming back Crystal from Grand River Solutions for our second webinar on disabilities work. Today she's going to focus on dyslexia and some of the related learning disabilities, as well as some universal design principles. So for the sake of time, I'm going to turn it immediately over to her. And thanks again for joining us, Crystal.
Thanks, Dan. Well, everybody, I'm going to get the screen up so we can start to see the slides, because we do have some material to cover today, and I want to give you as much time for questions as you might have. So give me just a second to share things here and we'll get going. There we go. All right, so well, that doesn't look like it was supposed to look. Give me one more sec. Did it to me again. Oh, very strange. Dan, I'm not sure. Not sure why that did it. We had it up and then it didn't come back up again. So give me just a sec and I'll try one more time. Show that screen, share that screen, share that screen, and share that screen. Okay, can everybody see that? I think that's going to be what we have. All right, so you all know me a little bit. Let's talk about today. We're going to talk about some of the language or learning disabilities that seem to impact our students. And the one thing I want to start off with is for all of us to realize, much like ADHD, language and learning disabilities don't show up like a vanilla cake. They come in often very individualized for each person that might have them. So it's not a one size fits all, but there are certain things that can really help us. So today's training is to look at those language and learning disabilities, the impact on performance, how you can offer accommodations that are alternative assessment methodologies, and then building for success for your students, okay? And if you have a question at any time, please don't hesitate to put your hand up and I'll try to call on you. So just a quick overview again of ADA 504. So these are the guiding principles and regulations that we have to follow on campus. So if a campus accepts even 1 penny of federal financial aid, they have to adhere to ADA 504. And now Section 508, especially if you're giving trainings or you're teaching online, you have to have your online materials also accessible. So these are the guiding principles again. ADA defines what a disability is. 504, Section 504 of the 1973 Rehabilitation Act really is how we apply academic accommodations in a college setting, and also K through 12 with some differences in the secondary as opposed to post-secondary. So these regulatory expectations, again, unlike K through 12, require a student who attends to actually disclose and request that they want reasonable accommodations. So the student must come to whatever official format the college offers, and they must disclose that they have a disability or a condition. Then they have to make a request and tell us what they're asking for. We're obligated to move into dialogue and to look at the details of what their disability or condition is, to enter into discussion, which is often called the ADA interactive process, and then look at providing what's called reasonable accommodation. As I said last time, for some of you who are here with us again, reasonable accommodation might involve somebody's preference, but usually doesn't. So for example, if I have a meeting with Dan and I am his faculty advisor, and it's just the two of us, it's reasonable, if I am hearing impaired or deaf, for us to use real-time closed captioning. It would not be reasonable for a sign language interpreter to be there. But in class, if Dan is in my class and I'm going over highly technical concepts, it's much easier for me or Dan to have a sign language interpreter in class so that he can focus on the subject matter. And because there are multiple people in class who might ask a question. Real-time closed caption sometimes doesn't capture all the nuance of what a classroom dynamic looks like. And so it could be very reasonable for somebody to have a sign language interpreter in class, okay? Also, ADA and 504 ask us to be able to ensure that there's equitable access to programs and activities and support when needed. So, for example, for an individual who has one of these language or learning disabilities, it could be extremely difficult for them to use an online app or platform to go in and register for classes. So they may have an accommodation that says that they can show up at the registrar's office on this day, date, and time, and the registrar will get them registered for courses through a more interactive verbal process as opposed to trying to get them to go into a website. So again, just a quick overview here of your process at CCS. So the student looks for and is seeking accommodations, and so they complete that disability verification form and they submit it. Sometimes they can submit their IEP or other documentation. An assessment happens. There's a development of the accommodations. The student and faculty are notified of that via email, and the interactive process continues. Oops. Sorry for that. So just a reminder, that interactive process in the best case scenario is always human-centered. So remember, it's the person first. You'll hear this language in ADA 504 rooms. It's the person first who just happens to also have a disability. So when I enter a room, people see Crystal. They don't see my traumatic brain injury, okay? They see Crystal, not what's hidden behind in my brain, okay? So it's not, oh, the brain injured girl, Crystal. It's Crystal, who also happens to have a brain injury, okay? This interactive process is meant to foster trust, that the student will be able to be heard and will receive the appropriate and reasonable accommodation. And it really is meant to support success. I can tell you, having been doing this for quite some time, almost 4 decades now, that what used to happen in the 80s would never be accepted today in 2023. We thought what was happening in the 80s was really cool and really cutting edge. But in today's world, it wouldn't happen. And so ADA and 504 have grown, along with the fact that individuals with disabilities have been given more equitable access to programs and activities in higher education, rather than being funneled into, let's just say, a technical school or an on-the-job training type of situation. That was especially relevant for individuals with language and learning disabilities, okay? So our language and learning disabilities, non-observable. Remember our conversation about observable and non-observable from last time? So an observable disability could be the fact that somebody has a guide dog. So we can tell that they're probably blind, or they're using a cane, white cane with a red tip on it. So you can say, oh, that person's likely blind. That's very observable. Non-observable disabilities, of which about 90% of the population has, as opposed to observable ones for the population of people that have a disability, can't be seen. So you can't tell if an individual has a heart condition unless they tell you or they're wearing some sort of external device. If a person has a learning disability or language disability, oftentimes it's not observable. Notice I said generally, yes, but your keen eye as a professor or instructor for a student might pick out some of the patterns that could actually reveal this. For example, before the days of computers and typing, spell check, okay? Now with computers and spell check, it's kind of hard if a student's been able to really learn how to spot problems in spelling. Spell check helps them with that. But spell check doesn't help them with content and context. So I use the example of peak, peak, and peak. Spell check is not going to know the difference in context of those 3 words. So if a student wants to take a peek at Mount Kilimanjaro's peak, because it piques their interest. 3 separate spellings, 3 different contexts that our spell check won't pick up on, okay? So remember from last session, non-observable disabilities may be those that impact that internal system, impact cognitive function, and that's what we're talking about today is cognitive function, and impact emotional or mental health, okay? So you're going to hear me say language or learning disabilities because it applies in both. Is just like ADHD, it falls into the neurodevelopmental disorder section of the DSM-5. And it's defined as difficulties learning and using academic skills, which, interestingly enough, translates to being able to function in everyday life. Activities like reading, writing, calculating, and in some cases, having fine motor skills to be able to perform a task, getting your brain engaged to do that. You know, one of the things I want to point out is that language and learning disabilities do not tell you that somebody has a low IQ. Okay, that's been a fallacy for a long time. So just because a person can't read or write doesn't mean that they are not intelligent. And so I want you to just be aware that those types of disabilities can impact how a person is actually tested or assessed on that scale for IQ. For example, let's say that I have a learning disability and I have to take an SAT test still to get into a college, and my SAT score is really low, but my GPA in high school is a perfect 4.0 and I'm taking AP classes. Common sense dictates that the SAT score is not reflective of my actual capacity to do the work or my actual intellect, okay? So what are some of the learning and language disabilities that we want to cover today? So I'm going to stay on this slide for a while so we can have conversation. The first is dyslexia, which presents itself often in reading. The second is dysgraphia, which often presents itself in writing, and sometimes with dyspraxia, the coordination of movements. So this is a student who turns in a paper that you can hardly read. They hand wrote it, you can hardly read it. It looks really poorly scribbled. This could also be your elderly parent who, moving into dementia or moving just into cognitive decline, can't write or the way that they used to, that beautiful hand script that, let's say, you might have known your mom to write, okay? Dyscalculia is something in which an individual has problems with math or numbers or sequencing. And dysorthography is spelling, okay? I had a real problem with that as a kid for some reason. So dyslexia can show itself up in numerous ways. It can be the reversal of words. It can be the reversal of letters. It can be the reversal of concepts. So for example, putting a prepositional phrase at the end of a sentence instead of at the beginning of the sentence. Once upon a time, comma, there were 3 bears. Somebody could actually write that, there were 3 bears once upon a time. So dyslexia can cause that kind of problem. It can cause problems with how you sequence your reading, how you might open up a textbook and be able to know what headings are where and what those headings actually mean, and then how to navigate the textbook to read the subject matter in order to then potentially take notes or write an outline to then be able to study. And it translates then in what you see in performance with regard to how a student gives you back information. Dysgraphia is the same sort of thing. It's writing, flipping things in writing or not being able to write properly. Sometimes we see this in concepts. So if I were giving a specific kind of psychological test and I ask somebody to draw something for me, and we see this when we're evaluating individuals with dementia or Alzheimer's or PICS. We also see that sort of disorder or a brain injury. You ask somebody to draw a clock and you ask them to draw the clock accurately. So all of us would expect, for most people that draw, not the most creative people, a circle with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And if you said, make the hands on the clock show 1 o'clock, we would expect that big hand to be up at the 12 and a little hand to be over at the 1. So somebody who has problems with dyslexia or dysgraphia may not be able to draw that clock like that. You may see them actually flip the clock. And so instead of 1 counterclockwise, that's why we use the term clockwise, they might put 1 on the counterclockwise and do it like this, backwards, okay? My head injury lets me read things backwards in a mirror. So something that's backwards in a mirror, I can read it perfectly fine. Still don't know how that is almost 40 years later, but I can do that for some reason. So dyspraxia is a very interesting concept because it is a detachment of your hands from the motor functions of your brain. So it's fine motor coordination. It isn't me grabbing the baseball bat and being able to hit something. It's me taking the pen that you want me to use to draw something or to decel something or to etch something and not being able to take that pen and actually translate that to the actual pad, paper, whatever might be the type of thing that I'm using to create, okay? So if you have a student who has this, you may find that they more regularly want to do things that are abstract as opposed to really detailed. So if you say, I want you to draw and create an etching of a penny, they may not be able to do that. But if you ask them to do something that looks Salvador Dali-ish of a penny, they may be able to do that easier because they cannot seem to get those coordination of those movements, and their brain isn't functioning to translate what it wants to have done in those coordinated movements of the hands, generally speaking. It can be other parts of the body, but generally the hands are what we're talking about here. In dyscalculia, it's math and numbers, and it really comes down to sequencing. So a student who is asked to add or subtract fractions, for example, some of us might be old enough to remember the old methodology of doing that, which is an upside down pyramid. So it used to be taught in an upside down pyramid. You have 1/2 and you have 1/4, and you're asked to create what this could be. So 1/2 and 1/4 in the pyramid equals a certain number, and it goes down to the next level until you finally have it added up. In today's world, they're using actual brackets. So I take my 1/2 and I take this line and I bracket it over here and I bracket it under the line over there. This is a nightmare for a student who is dyslexic and also has dyscalculia. They just can't seem to get that done. So numbers get flipped. I one time worked with a brilliant student who could not put the decimal place in the right place, no matter what you did to help them understand where the decimal point needs to be, okay? In cases like this, calculations are very difficult. This is where we might see an accommodation where a student might be able to use a calculator instead of having to do hand calculations, especially if they're putting together a solution or a formula, or and the best place for me to give you an example of that might be in creating paint colors from scratch, adding a little bit of this and a little bit of that to create a paint color. They might not understand how to do that. And so it ends up creating real problems for them. This can also create real problems for an individual just going out in the real world and getting change back or giving somebody the right change, okay? And then, of course, spelling. So a lot of us have issues with spelling. I was taught to spell phonetically, which really created my spelling issues. But a lot of people just can't spell. So who in the world would know that pterodactyl actually has a P in front of it? Or pneumonia, for most people, they hear pneumonia, so they think new, N-E, and you can often see it spelled N-E-W, as opposed to P-N-E-U, new, that P is silent. So spelling becomes an issue for these folks. You know, it was interesting to me in some of my research about these things all along that, you know, language disorders first were called a language stutter. So they tried to put it in the same context as verbal disorders. So you had a language stutter if you were dyslexic, or word blindness if you couldn't see something. Today, you know, we now know they're language and learning disabilities. So some of the myths behind language and learning disabilities. it's just laziness. The kid doesn't want to write it because they're just lazy, or they don't want to learn that because they're just lazy. The reality is that person in your classroom is probably thinking at a speed 5 times faster than everybody else, just to try to ensure that they're staying up with everybody else. It's exhausting, honestly, for a person like this. Some of the other myths are it's biological or genetic, so no way to correct it. And that's not the case all the time. Is there sometimes a genetic component to something that could get passed down? Certainly. Sometimes it's learned. If I have a parent who is dyslexic and they have learned strategies to cope, when I come home from school and I sit down at the kitchen table and mom or dad is helping me, they're going to help me by showing me how they learned it themselves, which could be a whole different strategy than how my teacher wants me to learn it, okay? So it could be environmentally learned. Sometimes the myth is that it's overdiagnosed. Sometimes it's hidden due to shame, okay? Sometimes the myth is it's just bad behavior, bad habits. Again, we talked about this before about an intellectual deficit. Certainly a student with Down syndrome who has an intellectual disability could also have a language or learning disability. Certainly a person who has cerebral palsy could have a language or learning disability, but intellect doesn't necessarily reflect in the learning disability, okay? Sometimes medication can help, but medication alone doesn't always work. And most people have to learn cognitive behavioral strategies to help themselves through these types of disabilities. And finally, the cookie cutter classroom approach, one size fits all. That's not true, especially if you have individuals with diverse learning disabilities or learning styles. All right, so I'm going to give you a case here that we might be able to talk about later on as we learn some of these strategies. So I'm going to read it aloud to you. Susan turns everything into music. In fact, the students know her for her witty raps about subjects, and she is often the class clown. Her verbal communication seems off the chart. However, Susan never likes to present material or to read aloud, making excuses to exit class if such an activity is coming, or creating a distraction, usually to get herself kicked out of class. She excels at all forms and function class assignments, meaning that if it's hands-on or she believes it's something that's going to require some sort of an activity that isn't writing or reading, she's there and she does very well. She rarely completes a quiz or a test in the time allotted, and sometimes doesn't even try to. This has earned Susan a reputation of being a difficult student, and now there's an academic progress concern. Susan chose CCS because her SAT score would not allow her to enter into the legacy university of both of her parents attended. It became the accepted alternative to a gap year. Her parents were really hoping maybe all she needed was a little diversion. Susan now reports that she likes doing, not writing. She often colors charts and drawings, reporting that this helps her get it. At times, Susan seems lost in the words and misses context without some type of added pictorial clues. So we're going to return to the case of Susan here shortly, but I want you to get a picture. I'm sure at least one of you, maybe several of you, have had a student like this in your class. So in the classroom, the student may appear to be not listening, or uninvolved, confused, or turned around. In some cases, they may deflect from the real issue. They may actually become the class clown or a conduct problem because they're embarrassed or they feel shame, okay? The impact that you're going to see is often in written language, like an essay test or spelling, or that the context in the content may be missing, like in fill-in-the-blank tests. In the classroom, often seen, interestingly enough, with ADHD, like we talked about last time, or an auditory processing dyslexia. So an auditory processing dyslexia, just to give a sidebar here, is something in which a student who is listening will hear things, but as it goes in, it gets scrambled. So sometimes they don't hear all of what you've said because their brain is trying to catch up. So they hear part A and part C, but not part B. Sometimes their brain scrambles the order so they hear it and think and repeat it to you CBA or BCA as opposed to ABC. So it's a processing dyslexia that happens, that the brain is twisting what it hears. Sometimes you'll note a student will get to class and sit on a particular side of class and just be insistent on sitting on that side of the class. You know, Joe is always sitting on the right hand up front, always, always, always. Joe has learned that if he sits up front and on the right hand side where his right ear is really hearing things and his left ear is blocked from distraction, he gets it. But if you move him to the middle of the classroom, he's all over the place. He's confused. So if you take ADHD and you mix it with an auditory processing dyslexia and then another type of language disability, you have rather a perfect storm in the classroom for a student. Okay? So some real-time observation that you as a faculty member can look for. Look for clues in the completed written assignments, like spelling errors, consistent, awful spelling, poor written script or poor printed words or sentences, or reversed letters or words, B and D, for example, an A and an E, sometimes replacing each other, or words that are flipped. Instead of Jane was coming, Jane coming was, okay? So you might see that, and I'm not talking English as a second language because we do see this in Hispanic speaking, French speaking, and Arabic speaking individuals, that they have a different form of grammar and structure to sentences than we do. And so you will see things like that. So this isn't about somebody who has English as a second language. This is a consistent pattern in a natural English speaker, okay? The student can't seem to get it or interprets concepts or flips information regularly. And we'll argue with you adamantly about it. No, that's not what you said. I have it in my notes. It's just like this, when that's not what you said, okay? Again, with ADHD as a comorbid condition, add hyper focus or obsessiveness, that still result in a lack of work. Sometimes you're going to see a student with real high anxiety. I one time in a graduate college level class had a student almost duck under their desk when I called on them because there was no accommodations in the classroom at the time for this person. So I called on them to please, come to the board and give us the appropriate format for a citation, because we were having to go over citations again because the class, these were graduate students who still didn't know how to cite work properly. And so I had to go backwards with them, and we had students doing things. And I thought this young man was going to have a panic attack. He really, really you could see it on him. And I said, well, let's just work together on the board quietly, you and me together on the board. So I tried to give some grace to him, and because I saw it happening. What I learned from that is don't do that in a classroom. Don't call somebody up to the board to do something. This was early on, probably in the 80s when this happened to me, because you never know. Remember, those hidden disabilities are sitting out there. And I'm going to go back to something I said in our first time together. Students entering college will try to often hide the fact that they had a learning disability or a 504 plan, or in a more extensive accounting, an IEP in their elementary, middle, or high school, because they were picked on, they were bullied, they could have been shamed, or they feel like if I can step into college, I don't need that anymore. I don't have mom and dad hovering over me telling me I have to have it anymore. And sometimes it's to their deficit, okay? So high anxiety can happen, especially in group work or projects. This might be where you see that you assigned everybody to do a group presentation, and our case here, Susan, would probably check out of that. You might have her group coming up to you going, Susan's not producing any work. Or you might have Susan proactively coming up to you saying, I just work better alone. I don't want to work with a group. So you may see those kind of high anxiety things. Student may start missing class on purpose if you have a very interactive kind of class where you're breaking them down into groups a lot, that they have to produce a written type of document. Or they may just be the person that says, I got all the ideas, but, my friend over here is going to put it down in writing. So they may develop a strategy to really contribute to the group, but you never see anything in writing from them. In fact, if they're assigned to be the group scribe, they're not going to be able to do it. Okay. These folks are often highly inventive and out-of-the-box thinkers because they have to be. They have to be able to finesse. I one time met a student who was really good with color, and he color coded all of his money because he really could not regularly understand the difference between a $1 bill and a $10 bill, or a $5 bill and a $50 bill. Okay, the $20 bill he didn't seem to have a whole lot of problem with, but those ones and tens and fives and 50s really messed him up. And so if he had money in his wallet, he would separate it with color so he would know what he was picking out. Because he regularly early on found himself giving away too much money or getting yelled at for not giving, let's say, the cashier enough money. Okay, so there are strategies. This can be very exhausting for a student who hasn't really developed good strategies and who isn't being honest with you maybe in the classroom, or honest with Dan about what has happened in the past for them. Or more recently, the last 20 years, we've seen military veterans who had no language or learning disability come back into the college environment after sustaining traumatic brain injuries or other kinds of injuries in a war zone, who now come into class and this used to be just simple for them. And now all of a sudden they're trying to figure out what's wrong with me. Something's going on. I can't seem to be learning. Again, this is where we see these newly acquired language or learning disabilities happening. It's not just military. It could be somebody who sustains an on-the-job work accident. For me, I was a high-level athlete and sustained a very severe brain trauma and cervical spine injury. So you just never know when it's going to happen to you. So remember, these crucial conversations, and you'll hear me call them crucial conversations because the way that you address this with a student and the manner in which you address it with a student really set the tone for whether that student is going to trust you and be willing to talk to you and to be willing to move forward with you, okay? So always in private. Never call somebody out in the classroom. And I know in today's age, none of us are likely to do that, but always in private. Know what you observe. You can easily say without violating ADA or 504, hey, Dan, I'm going to use again, Dan, as an example. Hey, Dan, I noticed that when I ask for small written paragraphs, I don't generally get those from you. I wonder if there's a different way for us to go about you getting the assignments to me. The student may then say, well, the reason why I don't write is because I'm dyslexic and my high school teacher always used to cream me on my grammar and my punctuation. Okay, well, this is a great referral to Dan because now Dan may be able to come up with a reasonable accommodation agreement that says that that student does things orally with you. So when you're asking for a test, they may do it orally with you as opposed to in writing, okay? Again, use examples. I can't tell you how often an example in a classroom goes a long way. Foster clear, non-judgmental expectations. I'm here to help you. Help me help you how to learn. Tell me what you need here. And then, I'm a real advocate of being very creative in a classroom. I don't mind something that takes a little longer to grade if it means the students walked away with something, a concept I'm trying to teach them, really ingrained in them. So some of the reasonable accommodations that you might see Dan creating with individuals with language or learning disabilities could be, test-taking format might be changed. It may be the use of a keyboard. This was really big during the time when we were transitioning from blue books. Some of you are probably old enough to remember blue books where you had to write in an exam book by hand to actually typing and actually having something small enough to carry into class to type. And added test time or a quiet test-taking space, okay? Sometimes it's substituted for practical exams or verbal exams as opposed to written tests or essays on subject matter. Oftentimes you'll see a note taker or the ability to record the class or video lectures and learning activities. If I can see it while I'm also hearing it, while I'm also reading it, I am likely to start developing skills to adapt and to get more proficient in reading, even with my learning disability. Audiobooks or other forms of audio mixed with visual learning are really excellent for this. And if needed, and I want to really make sure we understand what this means, because it isn't, I don't like Crystal as my professor, so I want an alternative class. That's not what we're talking about. When we look at assigning an alternative course selection in the ADA 504 world, it is because there is a documented disability that creates problems, often in sequencing. So for example, I am a student with dyslexia, and CCS requires, let's pretend that I take at least one semester of a language. Well, if I can't write it in English, how am I going to write it in Spanish or French or any other language? How am I going to learn to sequence it? And additionally, that other language may have different rules of grammar and punctuation. How am I going to learn to do that? It's likely I'm not. But what we have learned is that if you take the student out of that side of their brain and put them in a sign language class where it's very visual, they may excel. And so more colleges and universities who have a language requirement are going to allow sign language as an alternative course selection to meet the requirement for language classes, okay? Same with math. We may see that a student has very significant problems in algebra, in sequencing, and algebra and sometimes geometry are about sequencing. And so we might see an alternative type of class or class format for them to meet their math requirement, okay? Sometimes this also translates. These core courses translate to a problem later on. So if I cannot sequence numbers and you're asking me to create the right formula that might be used to glaze a pot, I may not be able to do that. But through rote memory or diagram, I might be able to do that. So these are some helpful hints about what some of the reasonable accommodations are. These are the more likely ones, but there are other reasonable accommodations that can be learned based on or given based on what we learn about what's going on with the student. So again, we continue to see these other impacting factors as we saw from our very first presentation, where the pandemic and social and emotional isolation have really caused a decline. A recent study was just given, the results of a recent very large study was just given about the impact on 3rd to 5th graders on reading during the pandemic. And it was astonishing to find that students in that age group, 3rd to 5th grade, were now in a 2nd grade reading level when they returned to school in regular classes in 6th grade. I was absolutely stunned to see that. And it was because they went into a vacuum. They went on social media, they went into different types of learning, but they weren't learning sequencing like we see as we're teaching that. Can that translate? Certainly. I want you all to be thinking forward. What's going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years when you start seeing the COVID generation of students entering college? What will you see? Where will the deficits be? Where will there be problems with students that may not have been picked up on because they excelled enough to be able to move on to the next grade level, okay? We're also seeing a continuation of these newly diagnosed conditions. So individuals with severe anxiety disorders are now starting to have disorders that look like language or learning disorders, okay? Again, campus culture, social media, and just individual experience of that student play a large part in what we think about students and how students might be able to interact with us in the college environment. So I'm going to pop through here again. Just I'll be sending these to Dan so that he'll have this to give out to you. But if you have any questions or concerns, want to reach out to me directly, you can do so, or you can reach out to Jody Shipper, who is your Title IX coordinator there at CCS. I'm going to stop sharing and come back to you all now. And I noticed there was a question. Oh, somebody, no, it's just somebody was leaving the meeting because it's being recorded. So I'd like to open the floor up right now to questions if anybody has them. And if you do, go ahead and just unmute and tell me who you are and ask your question. See, Joseph has his hand up. Go ahead, Joseph.
Crystal, is it okay if I call you Crystal?
Sure.
Okay, I'm Joe. Oops, I can turn my video on. So, you know, in my class, which is a studio class, you know, the students are making, is it still accurate, or in your research, have you found that the number of 20% of students are going to have dyslexia or show some type of dyslexic?
It's accurate to say that more students today are showing signs of this. Part of it is keyboarding. Students, the mind works very differently when you have if you don't have a problem with your motor movement, the mind works very differently when you take this pen and you put it down to paper. You slow yourself down from 400, 600 words per minute that you're thinking to what you're actually having to write. When we add a keyboard to that, we have somebody typing very quickly, we may not have that slowdown happening. We may see that dyslexia. I think from my clinical experience, dyslexia is often diagnosed as a standalone when it probably is an artifact or from another causal situation, like a head injury or poor learning habits or some other type of learning disability. So yeah, you're going to see it in 20% feels high to me. I'm thinking more along the lines of we're probably seeing in the 10 to 15%. But a recent study was really that came out was saying, I think they said 38 or 39% of students were showing real problems in reading and writing. Now, is that an artifact of COVID, or is that something has changed? I don't know about where you all are located, but they no longer teach cursive and handwriting in the elementary school here where we are. They teach you how to sign your name. But other than that, you're taking a typing class in 3rd grade. When I used to take, in my generation, you took typing class in high school. If you really wanted to do that, gosh, on a typewriter, you really had to hit hard because it was a manual typewriter. But our students today are engaged in a learning writing process very differently than we are. When you start to add in some of the artificial intelligence things that are going on right now, when you add in multi-screen and multi-stimuli, certainly those can create the artifact of dyslexia when somebody just is, their brain's going too fast. It's really that, as opposed to sitting down and really thinking about what they're trying to do. So feel like 20% might be a little high.
Yeah, I was just basing that on the Sally Shaywitz statistical work. This is, I don't know if it's outdated. Certainly the book is still in print, Overcoming Dyslexia. I think that was her number.
Yeah.
12% in boys, 8% in school-age boys, 12% in school-age boys, 8% in school-age girls. But I think my real point is, as an artist who struggles with dyslexia, I've always felt that the arts have been like a collector of students who have struggled in school and have found the arts to be like an avenue for, you know, success, because it wasn't reliant on some of the things that dyslexics struggle with. And so I guess I'm curious, and maybe this is to the larger group, do you see it more concentrated in an art setting?
I've worked in technical trades colleges. I've worked in graphic arts area. And I will tell you that I could support what you're saying. Students that came into technical college because they didn't want to have to sit down, read and write. They could read a diagram pretty easily to do plumbing or electrical work. Where it's gotten complicated, I think, for students is, let's use graphic design as an example, my limited knowledge of graphic design, so I'm going to apologize up front. But let's say that I'm using Adobe Pro and I'm in a video editing field of Adobe Pro. It's cut into 4 windows, and I have to move stuff around and I have to do things. My dyslexia can really impair my capacity to be actually proficient in doing that. Whereas if I use another type of software that may not break it down like that, DreamWorks is another one that I've used before. It's a little bit more linear in how you do things. So I think it's going to depend on what field somebody's in, and how they translate that. And also, you're going to inherit students who have been told they're stupid, have been told they're never going to make anything of themselves. That could have come from a teacher, a parent, other kids. And so they come in sometimes with this educational chip on their shoulder that they can't do things. And so if the college requires them to take a Gen Ed course, they're probably going to be really anxiety prone in that Gen Ed course, and then just probably wide open. If you're throwing a pot, they're going to be wide open. That to them is, well, there it is. I know what I'm dealing with, right? So I do see that. See it in technical fields. I see it not in the medical technical fields, but I see it in technical fields like heating and air conditioning, aircraft maintenance, things that are very hands-on, carpentry fields, construction. I've met some of the most ingenious human beings who are in the construction field. They could have probably been artists if they'd gone into an art institute of some type or a creative institute of some type. But you sit them down and ask them to do business plans for their company, and they just can't do it. So I think your interpretation is correct from my experience. How about other folks? Has anybody found this to be true from their lived experience?
I'll say from the formal side, we don't have a higher than I would expect rate of dyslexia on campus, just comparing to like national norms and whatnot. But there is entirely a possibility that I don't know about them and they're just being successful without any formal accommodations, because they did find their way here. So
yeah, it's strategy. You're exactly right, Dan. I mean, sometimes students adapt and overcome. So just a little bit about me. My brain trauma and neck injury happened when I was in my first year of graduate school. It was pretty severe. I saw triple for almost a year. So I had to step away from graduate school for a while. When I went back to graduate school, I found myself getting really confused very quickly. I was missing data and I was missing information. And I was very fortunate to have a professor who had, in another life before she got to the University of Virginia, had been a 5th grade teacher and a special ed teacher. And she was recognizing that something was up with me that I didn't even know was up with me. This translated for me in, not in essays, but I couldn't take a fill in the dot test to save my life. I couldn't move from here, question 1, it should be A. I could not move from that concept to that fill in the dot piece. It just would never work for me. She also recognized that I heard things differently. And so that really showed itself when, during one of my very first clinical counseling practicums, I was asked to make transcripts of my clinical sessions. And it took me 16 and a half hours to transcribe a 30-minute session onto paper. And even then I still got it wrong. And none of my colleagues had this problem. But that's the first time in my life I actually was sent to and got some type of an accommodation. Couldn't believe it. But I adapted. I moved very quickly to strategies that would let me adapt. One of them was to put things into formulas. So I learned very quickly that to memorize something, if I made a formula out of it, I could remember it. And strangely enough, I did that very well. But somebody else with a similar kind of brain trauma may not be able to do that very same thing. So I think we're going to see students who I'm going to bet, Dan, that out of your student population, there's probably an extra maybe 100, maybe 150 students who have something that have never come forward and probably never will, until they have that one moment when they can't get something done and it's going to impact them significantly at school. We see the same thing in the workplace, that individuals will adapt and overcome, and they won't come forward for accommodations in the workplace until they're under some sort of performance review or performance management for something that has happened, okay? Other questions or insights?
Crystal, there was a question in the chat about how instructors can help stop stigmatizing students with learning disabilities when they see that type of thing come up in the classroom, kind of stopping the ADA bullying.
Right. So one of the things that I do to nip it in the bud from the very start is that I have certain rules in my classroom, and they're stated the day that I read my syllabus to everybody, and I read my syllabus out loud, slowly, to the whole class the first day on purpose. Those rules are that we don't talk over each other, that I won't tolerate any form of bullying, teasing, or other thing. And you'd be surprised in college how students do this. I won't tolerate it verbally. I won't tolerate it on social media. I won't tolerate the kind of crosstalk. If a student somehow discloses that something's going on, and students start to mishandle or bully that person, I will pull the student who's being bullied aside and ask, what assistance do they need from me, or how can I help them help themselves first? I want to empower them to be able to take care of it. One time I had a student who asked to speak to the whole class. That's what he decided to do. And I gave him the space, the safe space to do it. He stood up and he said, some of you understand that I have a real bad stutter. And some of you understand that sometimes when I get really anxious, I really stutter badly and I mess words up very terribly. And I've noticed that some of you have started to stutter with me. And although you might think that that's supportive, it's not supportive of me. It feels very mean and it's very hurtful. That was the most impactful thing I ever saw a student do in a classroom, and it stopped immediately. So empowering the students to take control of their own world is a very important thing, but also setting the tone in class, that you're just not going to tolerate that kind of behavior from somebody towards somebody else right from the start. And I enforce it. I mean, I've asked a student quietly to step out into the hall, not at the very moment something happened, but just shortly after something happened. Hey, can I see you for a second in the hallway? And I asked the question. I usually say something like this. Hey, I wonder what led you to say such and so to such and so, and if you considered how hurtful that could be to that person. You know, I get them thinking about what it is that they've done, because the intersectionality of so many diverse people in a classroom leads people sometimes to do things that can be very hurtful. So I hope I answered that question. And I see Kristen's got a hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Crystal. I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to the co-occurrence of these learning disabilities. Like, how common is it for students to experience one or more of these disabilities, or does it tend to be more isolated in that they'd only be experiencing one of these disabilities at a time?
It's not usually as isolated as you would think. So we often will see auditory processing dyslexia and dyslexia together. Sometimes we will see spelling problems with dyslexia together. Sometimes you'll see an anxiety disorder with dyslexia and other things and together. So it's very hard to put things in a singular lane and make them sort of this is a purely dyslexic issue. Because sometimes we have that dyslexic issue, and because of the dyslexia and the anxiety, we now have ADHD, or we have something else attached to it. So it is very common to see them cross over. Most times you'll see somebody with a predominant disorder. So for me, I predominantly, because of the head injury, have an auditory processing disorder that translates itself to flipping to flipping phrases. For example, I one time said to everybody, I can't believe the swans have landed in Cappuccino. Okay, the phrase is the swallows to Capistrano. But my brain heard swans and cappuccino. So imagine getting laughed out of a meeting on that one. But you'll sometimes see it predominantly. So for me, predominantly, it's an auditory thing from the brain injury. It was a visual thing. So for that full year, I saw triple. It was very difficult. So I really couldn't read very well. I couldn't drive at all. I couldn't do certain things because I was seeing triple everything. But when that let up, it became more of an auditory processing thing for me. Sometimes these things fall into an area where you can't say it's one thing or the other. And so we'll see a diagnosis of specific learning disability as opposed to dyslexia or dyscalculia. And sometimes you won't see it at all. You'll see just a hint of something and it's not diagnosed yet. I can't tell you the number of people who I've now seen as an adult only now getting that first diagnosis. Oh, wow, all along you probably had dyslexia. What'd you do to adapt? And that person's got incredible strategies to adapt and overcome. So I think you can't make pure lanes out of it, Kristen, is the short answer. Sometimes you'll see it look more like one than anything else, but usually when you see a dyslexia, you also see other kinds of things that could trickle in, depending on how the person has been supported socially, how they've been supported in a learning environment, just who they are as a human being.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I see we've got about 3 minutes left before we're supposed to conclude. Does anybody have a burning desire, question, or comment? Well, as always, just want to let you know, it's been a pleasure for me to be able to be with you in the rooms. I appreciate everybody being very tolerant of Dan having to turn this into what felt like a ball in a cement room. We had to move it. Is this the fourth or third time, Dan, we had to move it?
Third date.
Okay,
Yeah.
Third date. I became very ill at the beginning of March, and I'm very happy that we're at the end of March and that April will be much better. So I do appreciate your grace with having to move things around for all of you that had things on your calendar and then had to bounce it. And for those of you that get to watch the recording because you couldn't be here today, again, if you have any questions, you'll see my information at the last slide. You can reach out to me.
Thank you very much, Crystal.
You're welcome. You all have a very nice Friday.